where do you see interest rates going? Super high demand in the private rental sector. Do you think that's sustainable?
I think it.
Welcome back to another episode of the PBK podcast. Each and every week, you are joined by myself, Kaz, from Property by Kazy, and another industry expert. Today, to my right, is Chris Frame from GetGround. How are you doing?
Really well, Kazy. Thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you for making your way down. So you are Senior Director at GetGround. Now, what is it exactly that GetGround do?
So GetGround are an all-in-one property investment platform, really founded out of cheap accounting services and really trying to help streamline the process for buy-to-let investors, particularly, I guess, with rising mortgage rates and other challenges going on, trying to help them structure it correctly to make sure it's the most profitable that it can be.
I think that's definitely important for a lot of listers, a lot of budding property investors, developers, people that want to hold property for the long term. The upside of property is that it can be a great investment. The downside is that, there is a lot of unforeseen administration that we don't necessarily plan for. Like, we don't see it on Instagram. You don't see all of the admin and things like that. One of the reasons why I sort of, were first introduced to GetGround was just looking at the cost of accounting traditionally versus your offering. Now, how does it work with GetGround in terms of cost?
Yeah, so we have a one-time setup fee, and then we have an ongoing monthly subscription fee, which covers all of our ongoing financial administration services. So that is all the bookkeeping, auditing, tax filing, submission of returns, or creation of the returns first, and then the submission of them to HMRC. We also take on the role of the company secretary, registered office address. So try to take on all of those services, and that is the £21.98 cost that we've mentioned. Traditionally, it's somewhere between 7 to 10, depending on the accountant, times cheaper than the traditional routes. And really, that was where GetGround was founded out from, was trying to create something that helped landlords and investors realize the benefits that a limited company could offer, which are numerous if it's the correct method for that individual, but to do so removing the two prohibitive factors that used to exist, which are predominantly time and cost. Used to be an expensive structure to set up, and then it used to be a very expensive structure to manage and administer each and every year with the use of accountants and solicitors. And then it also used to be a very time-consuming process, again, both on the setup side of things, where it often take weeks, if not months, to get a fully operational business created, but also then a time-consuming process to actually administer that entity as well, from all of a financial perspective. So really, that's kind of the piece where we've tried to come in, and not necessarily change limited companies, but just make them more efficient for investors.
I guess to become more of a holistic product, as opposed to having to sort of go here, there, and everywhere to set up different parts of the business.
Yeah.
Become more of a one-stop shop that you can come to GetGround, say that you can get me up and running so I can go and focus on whatever it is that I do best, whether that's finding my next deal, whether that's liaising with contractors, but, focusing on specific things, I guess.
Definitely. Like, if you look at the limited company piece, and previously, if you were doing it on your own, you could go to Companies House, for example, to create the company. Then you need to go and find a solicitor to produce the legal documentation for that, make sure it's structured correctly. Then you need to go and find someone to provide you with a business account for that limited company. And then you need to go and find an accountant to actually administer that limited company for you once it's operational, set up and generating an income. So all of those services all fall under our platform within that particular product, the limited company product that we offer. So bringing all of that into one place was super important, and that's really where we founded that from. And then that's evolved further, so we now offer other services to investors, whether that's finding property, selling property, financing property, to really sort of, as you say, bring that all-in-one experience for an investor onto the platform.
And how long has GetGround been in operation for?
So as a business, we've been going for about 5.5 years. I normally go down 4.5 years. Mainly that's because when I joined, but also the key milestone. The key milestone with that, the reason why I mentioned that is really it was 4.5 years ago we actually went live servicing customers. Okay. So the previous 12 months was sort of building out the tech, building out the products, and actually building out the system itself to make sure what we were doing was regulated, compliant, and everything thereafter. But 4.5 years ago is when we went live in actual servicing customers.
Okay, nice. And what was your background outside of, before pre-Getground?
Yeah, so my background was a property one. The business itself very much falls under that prop tech side, and I guess I'm very much an old school prop person rather than at the tech side, that's for sure. But I previously started off as in an estate agency, then set up my own estate agency, then went and worked for quite a large property developer based out of London, and then I actually moved overseas for 6 years to work for them, to sort of open up their international offering and really try and help facilitate investors buying into the UK, particularly from the APAC region beforehand.
Because we get a lot of people that are very interested in prop tech. It's, in terms of if people want to make a lot of money, it's like, it's where the real sort of your 10, 100, X amount, where the X's are basically. Yeah. For someone that's maybe interested in prop tech, what do you think is like a good skill set to have as a background?
It's interesting. I think for me, in terms of Getground, it was a case of having a property background. When Getground was able to go live, we could go and talk to people in the industry about it and how it could benefit either them as a partner or indeed their customers. And I think having that balance is quite important in my own opinion. And actually, when I met the founders of Getground, sort of about a year prior to joining, it was something I was quite keen to stress, was that actually having a great product is one thing, but you then need to have the realization that you can get an audience to listen to what it is and how it works. Because probably, like you've seen, there's a lot of gimmicky tech solutions, and I think that sometimes can dilute the space a little bit. I think there needs to be an actual need and value add proposition that's being created for the partnership or for the customer, and you really need to try and get that message across.
So where do you think Getground sits in that sort of real life application of, the prop tech that actually works functionally for a property investor? Like, what boxes do you think you tick for property investors?
I think where we bring the main, actually, I think one of the reasons I like it is I think at the forefront and almost to the market, we are a property business. It's a very personal business in that regard. It's predominantly built off building long-term relationships, whether again that with partners such as yourself or with customers as well. We want to say we're managing a limited company that on average people will hold that property for 7 to 10 years. So it's a long-term relationship. And actually where the tech and the technology really fits in is more in the background. So it's more enabling things to happen faster or more efficiently. If I look at our setup, it can all be done online in 20 minutes, for example, for a customer, regardless of where they're based. The bank account, the business account is then opened 24 to 48 hours thereafter with all of the legal documents verified, produced and signed electronically. So really the tech part sits in the background a little bit, which is where a lot of the time is then saved, and then naturally that's reflected in our own pricing, but in a reduction of costs.
That's good. I think one thing that I personally have enjoyed is that there's still the personal touch. I think with a lot of banking, particularly business banking, very much going the way as unless you're really big, you don't really have a relationship manager anymore. I've definitely found that I've always had like a consistent point of contact as opposed to just going through the kind of, onboarding system where it's very sort of bot-led. I've always had a personal point of contact, which I found quite valuable. Yeah,
it's the amount of times I hear internally, it's a case of, let's automate it. And it's and that's great in many ways, but you can't literally automate everything. People want to talk to people, and when you're, as you referenced earlier, right, it's a big purchase that someone's making if they're investing in property. It's very difficult to just do that without human engagement.
Have you heard of I think it's like the theory of like the doorman, of like getting rid of like the doorman at front of house of a hotel? Like in reality, you could automate it through a revolving door and cut the cost, but how that then feels going forward and the thought process and the feeling that invokes as a customer.
Completely, and it's an expectation as well. And actually, a lot of people want that more concierge service, if anything, rather than they do a lack of service.
Because I think the reality is a property purchase in most cases represents somebody's like largest one-off expense as well as their largest amount of their monthly recurring revenue. So in terms of the service that you expect around that, you do expect like your high value level of service as if you were buying a high ticket item anywhere else in the world.
Completely. And especially when for us, particularly around the limited company piece, we're talking about how to structure it in an efficient manner. So again, you need to have that information, education, that support to really guide someone to make sure they're making an informed decision that's actually right for them. So we think it's super important. So that's not going anywhere, even though we'll definitely try and automate a lot of things just to make it more simple. But the human piece and the human interaction is certainly not going anywhere.
I think it's important. Like whenever, I'm looking at lending options, I always prefer lenders that have like physical underwriters as opposed to like an underwriting software, because that whole computer said no. I think it was from Little Britain. Like it was a sketch from a while ago, but it can be very frustrating, particularly when you're at the end of the day, you're in property. In most cases, there's a few accidental landlords, and but in most cases, you're in property to try and make money. And when you're just sort of being met with like a brick wall over stuff that doesn't necessarily make sense, it can be very frustrating.
Especially if you're finding those things further down the line. You talk about the mortgage piece. It's quite easy to get a decision in principle, really, and it's only later down the line when you find out why something may be rejected for some criteria that was never asked for you up front. So it's it's trying to keep that level of service and just guiding people through, as you say, especially for newer investors, and certainly for GetGround, we've got a mix of investor profile types, but we certainly seem to have created a value proposition for sort of either new or early stage investors looking to build a portfolio. And I think one of the reasons behind that is a level of transparency, but also just that information and guidance that encourages them to that property is a good thing and it is a good investment when it's done correctly, but you also need the support and to make sure you make the right decisions for it to then be profitable and successful.
So I think obviously you've touched on sort of timeframes in terms of speed for setup, also timeframes in terms of saving administrative costs from bringing things all into one place, and then actual savings in terms of the actual cost. Other things that I think people are often asking me about is particularly the investment vehicle type. So how does GetGround work if people want to set up JVs or SPVs? Is it fit for purpose for people that are working with partners?
It can be. I mean, we create very simple special purpose vehicles, SPVs, and they're designed specifically for the purpose of buying buy-to-let property in the UK. So in that regard, they are very much fit for purpose. Currently, we would look that every shareholder of that SPV is an individual, and we do that for simplicity, but also for transparency. And again, it's keeping things simple that enables the cost to be reflected within that. But it does act as a very good vehicle for people who are buying with friends, or, as you say, as part of a wider JV setup, albeit as individuals, ideally. And we've actually widened that services now where it helps for limited companies that are already set up that can now be brought on to our platform, in the sense they don't need to have been created by GetGround, but they can benefit from the ongoing services that we offer. And also what we are seeing is a lot of personal landlords or properties that are owned in personal ownership being transferred into limited companies, and a lot of that is for inheritance and estate planning, which sort of feeds into the same mechanism of having a very flexible, fluid ownership model that can be amended, adjusted accordingly, or as you need, as it sees fit. So
for someone that's maybe, whether or not they're potentially helping parents or whether or not it's the person themselves that are looking to do some estate planning, do you have like a service where people can reach out to you to find out if it's fit for purpose, or who would they reach out to?
We do. We've got, obviously myself and Nikita are always widely available to talk to anyone. We do have a team of consultants who are very happy to spend time with any individual who wants to talk through their options or their current setup and situations. We don't charge anything for any consultations or any ongoing support until someone actually signs up with GetGround. We've got a whole variety of different calculators for people to use, where we can literally go through them and input different numbers to see whether it is the right thing for them to do or not to do. That's more common, I guess, when you're changing the ownership structures. Generally speaking, in today's climate where we are right now, with the higher mortgage cost, the price of property itself, limited companies tend to operate very effectively for any new purchase, and we see that through a lot of the data. I know you and I were talking before we went on around data, and it's a useful tool. It shouldn't be solely relied on, but there is a lot of data there to show that 75% of investors now are using limited company structures for the benefits that it offers for those buying today. That is.
No, I think definitely. I think there was a thing before where, the problem with a lot of social media and advertising in general is it's very short form. So because of that, people need to get a point across very quickly, which means it isn't often very balanced. And in most cases, you know, the response is always like, we should speak to an accountant to obviously confirm what's the most efficient for you. I think I'd probably go a little bit further than in terms of now buying property, it's probably even a bit higher than 75% in terms of the limited company structure. You're always going to get the personal tailored advice, but obviously because of changes in taxation, it's made it a lot more efficient to, you know, to buy property in the limited company structure for the vast majority of people, as opposed to before it was kind of more, it was more weighted, it was more evenly weighted depending on circle.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think it's more of a case of just making sure any individual reviews all the options that are available to them. You know, you alluded earlier that property can be a very powerful and very positive investment tool, and definitely should form or can form a positive part of anyone's investment portfolio, but it's still very easy to make relatively simple mistakes if you just follow it in an uninformed way.
It's interesting you touch on mistakes. What, like, I guess from, you see people coming, you know, into the property space. Are there any like common mistakes or things that you could, you know, let people know, things, you know, mistakes that you see sort of front side that would help potential investors?
I think the biggest one for me is actually just seeing investors make uninformed decisions. They sort of say yes to something and do something, having maybe not fully thought it through, or they start thinking it through a little bit later than perhaps they should do. I think that's the most common one. It probably covers quite a broad range of areas. I'd say it's getting less. I think when I started at GetGround, actually, one of the sort of more surprising aspects to me was almost the lack of awareness that was greater in the property industry than I think I thought it was. Yeah. But I think that is changing in part. I'd like to think down to GetGround, but not solely down to that. I think it's just the methodology, and I think a lot of businesses have approached it now in a very different way, in the sense that it has to be far more informed and educational led, rather than the sort of the hard hitting, heavy selling approach, which I think has often led to people making fast decisions, which can be problematic.
I think in general, in the property space, obviously, you know, property investment as a whole, outside of maybe a bit of compound interest, is not really taught in schools.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot more general content, educational pieces, and there's some rubbish out there, like we're not going to pretend like there isn't, but there's a lot more education. I mean, people can take a more, you know, a more educated stance when it comes to looking at potential opportunities.
Yeah, and I think it's more widely accessible now than either it was, or at least it was perceived to be. And I think that's a big decision. I mean, having done quite a little bit of work overseas and looking at sort of the foreign investor markets, you know, there was a number of businesses that could go out there and tell them or try to claim that X development or property was a number of minutes away from a train station or a tube station, and actually the reality wasn't that the case. And now that education levels have been improved, there's far more easier resources online to find out whether that's true or not. And you lose a lot of credibility now very quickly if you start making kind of false claims. So I think that's been a real shift in the industry, in my opinion, sort of over the last sort of 5-8 years or so, and certainly something I've seen a lot of firsthand. But it can still be quite easy to get led in a direction that people might not always want to go down.
Yes. So in terms of, you mentioned other services outside of the formation and accounts and you know, business account setup. What other services have GetGround got coming or that are currently available?
Yeah, so we've got a few others. The most recent one is actually around financing. So we've become a whole of market independent mortgage broker. So we've got qualified personnel now in-house. We used to work very closely with a couple of partners on that, but we've brought that in-house just to try and enhance and deliver our own customer journey and customer experience. So that's been a really useful tool. We know people, if they're buying property, they want to know how to structure it, and they then want to know how to finance it. And again, limited company mortgage financing, it's changed a lot over the last sort of 5-8 years. There's a lot more options available now than there previously were, and in the main that's because more and more investors are going down that route, and lenders have therefore had to adapt their own routes to market and also their own criteria around it. And as a result of that, the mortgage space is a lot more competitive, within reason, around the current Bank of England base rates, but a lot more competitive in terms of options and choice for investors. So that's been a real positive, and we've seen a lot of take up on those services, particularly because we have quite a lot of that trust, given that we do a lot of the ongoing accountancy services. So again, it makes sense to have all of that in one place, which has been great. And then one of the other big areas is around investors either looking to increase their portfolio and looking to buy another property, and also those landlords perhaps looking to exit the market. And where we've tried to set ourselves up is to create a marketplace that attracts investors one way or the other. So either investors looking to buy or landlords looking to sell. And what we've seen a lot of, particularly in the second-hand property market space, actually, is a lot of investors are now looking at second-hand property, particularly things that are tenanted, immediate cash flows, guaranteed rental incomes. There's a lot of known facts around that. And equally, we've got a lot of investors currently looking to exit the buy-to-let marketplace, just given market conditions, particularly if they've owned the property for a long period of time, if it's in their own personal name. The sort of increasing mortgage rates and change of taxation rules have hit them quite hard from a profitability perspective. So marrying up that sort of demand and supply has been a big factor of what we've tried to do. A lot of agents have often shied away a little bit from selling tenanted property. And so we see there's quite a big opportunity there for us to do so, just given the investor database that we have, but also trying to create a bit of a situation where every party involved in that transaction wins. You've got a landlord that wants to sell, a buyer that wants to buy, but also you've got a tenant. And actually, if you can make that transaction happen without the tenant needing to be leaving the property and creating a vacant possession, it means that they remain unaffected, other than a change of ownership and a change of landlord, which I think is a real positive and sometimes gets forgotten a little bit about.
I think that's interesting you mentioned a tenant there, because I do think across the board there's very much like a bad landlord stigma.
Yeah.
Maybe globally, but definitely a lot in the UK. I think because there is the old adage that like an Englishman's home is his castle, and I think as a result the landlord side of things is often almost seemed like the bad guy. As a company positioned, very much around the buy-to-let market, how have you found that's kind of affected you?
Yeah, I think it's been tough in a way, because you say that it's sort of there are various expectations or suspicions, if you like, within the marketplace and the industry, which are hard to shake, despite sort of the best intentions. But I think it's really where we've come from. We used to have the tagline of "Buy to let done better," and actually we include that in every aspect of that, whether that is from a tenant, a seller, a landlord, the mortgage piece, solicitors. And we want to work very closely with the right partners, the right sort of professionalism involved in that, to make sure that a service is delivered, but ultimately everyone gets the outcome that they want to have, or indeed should have. And I think we sometimes forget that people do have the right to live in a property, and you really want to sort of support and facilitate that. The buy-to-let market is a big part of the wider UK GDP and economy, and tenants are a big factor within that space, and they need to be supported as much as landlords do, as well.
I think I'm of the impression that the modern tenant gets, whether it be through changes in legislation, changes in attitudes towards tenants, I think that they're considered a lot more in the process, not just because of attitudes towards tenants, but also the understanding of the movement of transactional costs over towards the landlords. The landlords now understand that finding a new tenant costs money, void periods cost money, administrative costs cost money. So if you can service and maintain a great tenant, they're actually adding value to your asset. And you mentioned selling tenanted properties. If you've got a property that's been tenanted by somebody who's been there for 10 years, has never missed a rent payment, and it's been amazing, that actually creates a level of value for that landlord selling their assets. I think it's important that they are kind of given their credit as well within the whole ecosystem. Definitely support that, and to say, it removes an awful lot of the uncertainty involved. Buying a new property, probably not now, but it used to be the case. You're almost allowing a month to find a tenant, get them moved in, and get them paying rent. And at which point, that first month's normally when the agent fees get deducted. So really, it's sort of month 2, maybe even month 3, when you're starting to see that income actually materialise. And so hopefully that's a piece that can help investors a lot. Couple of questions. I guess these are more opinion based as opposed to whole market, but just where, and these sort of more quick fire questions, but where do you see interest rates going? This is more of again personally, you're not asking if you to speak on behalf of entire
$1 million question,
organisation.
Isn't it?
So where do you see them going? Maybe just over the next sort of, we'll say, to the end of sort of Q4 this year.
Yeah, personally, I do think they will come down. I'm not expecting a big sharp drop. I know some are forecasting that. I look back over sort of the last 20, 30 years, the Bank of England base rate predominantly has been around 5.75% on average. Mortgage rates sort of 5 to 5.5%. My own view is I think they'll end up settling around 4%.
I think particularly around the election year as well, there's always a little bit more give than there would be.
There's a lot of political pressures, and but any party is going to need to do something in the property space that's attractive. So I don't think anyone will be trying to do anything to dampen that. I'd expect a little bit of a drop, but I don't think we're going to go back down to sort of the very low rates we had for a number of years.
It's not really sustainable, I think, is it? So you touched on obviously the fact that right now, if it takes you a month to fill your property, you're probably doing something wrong. Super high demand in the private rental sector. Do you think that's sustainable? Where do you think prices are going to go in the private rental sector space? I think
the demand is sustainable. I think the way that house pricing and particularly around affordability continues to go up, it means that really the rental sector is growing. There is a huge shortage of housing in the UK. It's sort of 400k homes now plus need to be built every single year.
I think, what did Michael go try and say? I think he said he wanted to build, was it 1.5 million over the next, which I don't know where they're coming from.
And that's the thing, they're never meeting these numbers. I think the highest is about 150,000 that's ever been built in any 1 year. So you're at least 2xing that number in conditions that aren't very easy to do that as well. So personally, I think that shortage is going to create even more demand for the rental space. So I think the demand will remain. The question then is around affordability, and does that demand supply mean that tenants start getting priced out of the market? I don't think they will, but I think it is a concern or a factor that should be just sort of thought a little bit about. But yeah, I don't see the demand going anywhere, and I can only see that going up.
And I guess from someone who deals with a lot of the market sort of more holistically, seeing it from sort of top down, are there any things that you think could help, whether it be the buy-to-let market, even the residential market space?
I definitely, I think financing is still a key factor within it. I think that's getting a mortgage is still quite a time-consuming process, and it still feels there's quite a lot of variables involved in it, which I don't think actually is the case, but it's almost the perception around it. And then I think one of the other big areas is probably around the conveyancing aspect as well. It can, again, take a long time for a transaction to actually go through. And
I think that's a very polite way, very polite, politically correct way of saying that it's archaic.
Yeah.
Slow, and the fact that you still have to physically get scanned and fax documents over and things like that is...
exactly. And whoever can fix that will do very, very well. And that could be a prop tech space. But finding that solution will be very difficult because it's a big change in a wider marketplace. But and it kind of goes against tradition. But it shouldn't. A lot of the transactions that we see, and probably you and I have been involved in, shouldn't have taken as long as they did.
It's just some things, like I think, like if you could centralize certain things, so it's like I do quite a bit of business in Dubai, and very much you use like your main Dubai passport app. So you want to sign your contract, you log in, you got your Face ID, you can sign it. It's, they've sort of tried and tested it, that it works for that sort of security, versus I think a lot of us are tired with having to sign like ILAs and find a solicitor that will be happy to do them and things like that. So I think if you can streamline that process, I think it's a massive
I always reference auctions actually in the UK. As you say, Dubai is a great example, Singapore, Hong Kong or other markets that have a very quick, efficient way of buying. But I look at the auction piece, and yes, you can do some of the pre-searches beforehand, but you can't do everything before you've purchased the property and exchange contracts, and then everything does seem to go through in 28, 30 days depending on the auction. So it can be done. You just need everyone aligned and set up for it to happen. But yeah, that's something that ideally would be fixed.
That's something. All the prop tech geniuses out there, there's money to be made. You just have to, find a... I think it's the issue really, though, is dealing with government and obviously stuff that's outside of your control. So when you're dealing with land registry data and all of these things that are effectively,
And it's just the way it's stored and held.
Exactly,
I think that's the other big thing as well, right? It's not set up almost to be taken with tech or...
It's like solicitors is one of the only places you'll go to and find boxes and boxes of paper files that they legally have to keep for a certain amount of time.
I always feel they make me look like a tech savvy person, which says a lot. So
that's definitely the case. So in terms of what you feel like is obviously GetGround have done a lot over a relatively short space of time, but obviously you get a lot of that consumer feedback loop. What's sort of next for GetGround, or what else are you working on?
Yes, we've recently launched some investment pots, so to really try and create a bit more of a financial services aspect to what we're trying to do, and that's something we've just launched and has been positively received by our customers. A lot of what we try and do, and sort of the next steps we take, often comes from demand and constantly speaking to our customers to ask them what could be done better, what else would you like, what other services would appeal to you. And once we reach a point of not necessarily critical mass, but we start hearing the same things over and over again, it's how do we then try and find a solution for that. The investment pots is a big piece of that. The business accounts that we set up for our limited companies are very simple debit accounts, so they weren't accruing interest, for example, but there is now the ability to keep the money on the platform without having to take it off and bring it back online as and when you might want to do so, but start to earn and generate an interest and an income off that. So that's been something that's really positive. At the moment, I guess we're really just trying to streamline all of the services. We've really gone in the last 6 to 12 months from being a one product business to sort of a multi-product offering, and it's now how do we make sure that user experience across all of the services works and works correctly with the right customer journey, albeit that customers can come to GetGround for each product as a standalone. So it's how do we marry that up. I would love us to try and do something a bit more in around the property management piece, but I think that's still some time away, realistically. But just, again, we talked about the tenant earlier. How do we bring everyone a bit more involved into the process? And I think that's probably the big ticket that we still need to figure out, but I'm sure we will at some point, but it's not kind of the immediate plan.
Definitely sort of like property management is a big side of that sort of, ecosystem. I think if that can be brought into play alongside with, the accounting, alongside with the formation, it would definitely kind of sort of have that related services side of things. When it comes to the tenant, I always thought that, as someone who's, been a tenant, paid rent, I think that in terms of that build up to getting from being a tenant to maybe being a homeowner, the idea of being able to add rent to a credit file, if you've consistently been able to pay £1,000 a month, but then you get met with that, we can only borrow 4.5 times your earnings, which means you can only borrow like up to the point where you're paying £600 a month, has always sort of been a bit of an area that I think obviously needs looking into to make sure it, covers the lenders. However, sort of understanding fit for purpose and moving outside of that computer says no space could be beneficial to the tenants as well.
Yeah, I do agree. And actually it's interesting because I think that probably slightly more relates to tenants looking to buy their property for themselves.
Exactly,
And what we see quite a lot of actually is tenants and first-time buyers, so having not bought a property before, but coming to us, often set up a limited company because they're actually looking to buy a buy-to-let investment property first. Because the price point typically is a little bit lower than maybe what they'd want to buy for a property that they want to actually live in. But also you can get the deposit for that, therefore quicker, but actually having a bit more flexibility. And I think we touched on it earlier on, but that affordability piece for someone looking to buy their own property is such a big challenge right now that I actually think a lot of tenants are remaining tenants as choice and actually almost building up a property portfolio, buying sort of 1, 2, 3 other properties for investment purposes, almost rather than focusing purely on that sort of aspirational want to own their own home immediately.
Oh, definitely seeing a lot more of that. And in terms of, when people are looking at property both as an investment vehicle but also as a home, and then saying, do I really want that level of equity potentially tied up in the type of property that I want to live in based on the level of, funds that I could borrow on a mortgage? A lot of people do say I'd rather rent where I'm living and then still have the investment properties that would enable me to reduce my sort of monthly outgoings.
Yeah, and we saw it a lot during kind of COVID times as well, actually, because I think it kind of reminded everyone of having the ability to almost a level of freedom, which there's a big argument that renting almost gives you more of that than actually owning the property itself.
So I think when we look at kind of, we hear things about generation rent, but it's not always generation rent because of economic circumstances, generation rent because the same way it's more of generation Uber. A lot of people like the idea of being able to have that flexibility, and if I want to get a car, I'll jump on an app and I'll get the car. If I can use Zipcar when I want one, however, I don't want to be tied down to a fixed location or a fixed premise or a fixed vehicle, and those required expenses as well.
Completely. No, we've seen an awful lot of that.
So if people want to connect with you, find you going forward, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, very welcome to, obviously there's a website itself, which is getground.co.uk. Obviously they can reach out to yourself, who can make the introduction to myself or Nikita, who I know you know really well. But yeah, please do reach out. We'd be delighted to have a conversation with anyone. Obviously make sure they reference you as well, because we're always keen to know, how investors have found out about us, and we're really keen to build long-term relationships.
I'm sure I'll speak to the amazing Nikita, who's behind camera hiding right now, and I'm sure we'll get some sort of link to include. But it's been amazing having you on. Thank you very much. This has been another episode of the PBK podcast. Each and every week we have an amazing guest. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. If you've got any questions, comments, let us know in the comments, and I'm sure someone will be around to help answer them. And apart from that, I'll catch you next week.